So we're going to transition right into speaker number 2, and we have with us you are here, aren't you? There you are, Seth. I couldn't see your picture for a minute. I was like, oh gosh, I hope he's still here. Yeah, Mr. Seth Whitehouse. So he is the agent and the county director in Anderson County. Man, he is, I know I keep saying our go-to people for everything, but we've got folks that we know that we love to go to for certain topics, but Seth is our insect guy. Don't call him a bug guy. It's not bugs, it's insects, right?
That's
So,
right. Yep.
yes. And he does a wonderful job of really um, explaining things and helping us understand that whole insect world. And so he is going to dive us deep into identification and scouting and where we need to be looking on plants and when we need to be looking for different types of insect and disease issues on our vegetable gardens. And I think this is the perfect way to kind of wrap everything that we've talked about this month up, put a nice little bow on the top of it. And I will also mention that Seth and Greg are on our fruit and vegetable work group, and that is our group of agents and specialists who, we get together monthly to plan educational programs like this and publications and just really get the ball rolling on lots of different things. So you have both of them to thank for a lot of the information that we've been putting in the chat boxes or have the publications that have been referenced throughout these classes. So with no further ado, Seth, take us away.
Thank you, Celeste. Yeah, that was perfect. And Greg did a great job on all those cultural practices that will hopefully lead up to success in the garden. And if there's one thing that I can get y'all at least getting one acronym down today, and that's IPM. So Integrated Pest Management is one of the most important items that I'd like to jump into today. Not only just about insects, but diseases, and we'll kind of go through there. And let's say you followed every cultural practices recommended by Extension, and you followed Greg's recommendations to this presentation. But I always see the biggest frustration in the garden is always with those pests and diseases, right? And so we want gardening to be a fun, relaxing hobby, and we never want it to be frustrating trying to figure out what's been eating all our vegetables and crops right there. So um, I want to lead this too. I didn't put a picture of an insect on our title here because it's a lot of times us going out there identifying as best as we can to narrow down what is the culprit, who is the culprit causing this issue. And misidentification is always the number one issue when it comes to not being able to resolve that issue. So a lot of times people just want, hey, just tell me what to spray. That's all I want to do. But we got to figure out what that insect or what that disease is. Maybe it's not even an insect or disease. So that's why we got to start with the first thing here is scouting. And so if you guys don't already follow UT Hort on Facebook, please follow us. We have some awesome tidbits of information as you go through the growing season. And one of my favorite ones is this one, getting started, and it all starts with scouting. And now's a perfect time to do this. So we want you to go out to your garden if you're not on vacation on Memorial Day weekend or whatnot, and try to get out there frequently, at least once or twice a week, and just going through your plant material there. And some of y'all might have smaller container gardens that you can go through each plant, but for those of you that might be in a larger in-ground garden kind of situation or multiple raised beds, just try to scan through those randomly and find maybe patterns of diseases or insects that might be popping up. And so if you do find any of those insects, have your camera ready with you. I know everyone's got a smartphone these days. Just take a picture of them and before it flies away, or maybe a little caterpillar that you can collect and identify as well. So and I'm here to say that there are over 1 million insects identified in the world. And so no way, even as an entomologist, can identify every single little insect. So if we can at least know the good ones and promote those good ones, that'll help out a lot. And so when we're going through here scouting, know your resources. I know I had a little Sherlock Holmes picture there too, and a lot of times that's me here getting on the interwebs and trying to narrow down what is my host plant and maybe what are some common pests on that host plant. So I know we talked about cucurbits, we've talked about peppers and tomatoes in previous series. And then all those insect pictures that were presented by Celeste and other presenters today here as well, of what some of those culprits or common pests might be on those host plants. And so I also have a image there, or a logo, excuse me, of iNaturalist, which is a fantastic app on your phone that you can take pictures of an insect, and actually help to get down at least to a family or order even of that insect, just to really figure out what it might be to get you a little bit closer to identification there. But the most important part when we're out here scouting is a lot of times we don't actually see the insects out there, right? We see the damage or the evidence that they're leaving. And so when you're out there in the landscape, in the gardens, maybe go through a Z pattern, just kind of randomly looking through. And we're not just looking on the top of these plants. We're looking at the base of the stem to see if there's any insects that might be ovipositing eggs at the undersides of the leaves. We're checking the entire plant as best as we can. And we're coming prepared. Like Greg said, we're making records of potentially some of those insects that we found in this year that might help with future years. And it all goes into this IPM, this integrated pest management, is with scouting. And so now that we've scouted our whole garden area, and maybe we see some, like Greg's can't get right there, acronym as well, ain't doing right, excuse me. We can see what ain't doing right with this chart as well. So um, on the left, we have some non-living abiotic issues that we might see building up in the garden. So whether that's a nutrient imbalance of maybe way too much fertilizer, we loved it to death, or maybe not enough. Maybe just get that soil test to figure out if that's the case. Maybe we've had periods of drought or really weird hail that came randomly through East Tennessee, and maybe caused some damage, even mechanical impact as well. So there's a lot of abiotic issues that could be leading to what we're seeing here and might not actually be caused by an insect or disease. Now, on the right side of this image, that's highlighted in yellow, you'll see maybe some of those more common diseases that might be spread by viruses, bacteria, fungi. Again, thousands and thousands of potential culprits that could be causing these diseases. And then even working down towards insects, nematodes, and other herbivores, whether that's deer that we've kind of mentioned before as well. So I want us to just understand that there's so many different potentials of what we call disease, whether that's a environmental disorder, a disease spread by a fungus or a virus, or maybe just injury of hail or a deer, right? So that all kind of goes into that broad sense there. And so to separate these two between diseases and insects and how we as the gardener can control and hopefully prevent or react to this, we got to differentiate this. So diseases, let's focus on diseases here. And so I usually like to have people raise their hands, but not in a Zoom call here. But everyone's played Uno, I hope, right? It's a fantastic card game. And I just love the concept that there's a reverse Uno card. And so on this reverse Uno card, you can switch it back and like it never even happened, right? It's going the other way. So there is no reverse Uno card when it comes to diseases. So there's no way to prevent or excuse me, there's no way to counteract that damage that's already caused lesions or maybe some yellowing of that plant material. It's like Greg said, the cultural practice. We're going to snip off and maybe prune off that disease part of that plant. Or maybe we can prevent further damage by potentially putting down a fungicide product if it is a fungal disease to prevent further damage. So I just wanted to reiterate that there's no reverse of those diseases. And then when it comes to insects, there's no skip Uno card. So you can't just put something down and hopefully skip any pest building up in your garden there. Because if there is a host, there is most likely going to be a pest that is going to try to compete for those resources, right? So good little comparison there of being proactive with our cultural practices and then maybe being reactive and how that kind of differentiates between a disease and an insect. And so um, I'm going to show you all what we like to call the disease triangle. And so on the left side, we have a pest. And so maybe that might be a fungal pathogen. So in this case, maybe a blight. That might be soil-borne pathogens that another reason why we might need a crop rotate to kind of break up that life cycle there and prevent these buildup of soil-borne pathogens like blight and whatnot. And then also a host. So in this case, it's a tomato. And so if all three of these pests, host, and perfect environmental conditions come together, we have in the middle the disease that will finally come, right? So if we can separate and remove one of these sides of the triangle, the disease is not going to appear. So whether that's removing tomatoes completely that year and crop rotating off to another site or another soil, or excuse me, another crop, that'll hopefully prevent that blight from building up. And again, we talked about cultivar, cultivar, cultivar. Maybe we're just going to select a cultivar that can be resistant to a certain disease that we see building up in the gardens as well. So that's what we mean about the disease triangle, and uh, disrupting that life cycle as best as possible. And that's one other concept I want to get down today too, is timing is everything when it comes to IPM. And so for insects, it's a little bit different, right? So we see the insect here on the left, and I'm just going to give an example here of a squash bug, right? We talked about cucurbits and everyone's trouble with those little squash bugs that are nymphs. They're in that middle stage. They're from egg to nymph to adult in that incomplete metamorphosis. And so you can see here's a cultural method of just capturing them with tape, right? An easy way to control and and capture these. But let's say, whoa, they've just built up a whole population out of control. And that's what this chart, or excuse me, this graph is all about here. So follow along if you can here. So on the bottom line here, we've got time. So here we are, we're at the beginning of the growing season, and we've got one squash bug here, and we're able to collect them on this tape here. Not a high number of pests here on that y-axis just yet. So, we don't need to spray anything here. We can control, remove those eggs as best as possible, and do our best to do some cultural control here. Now, this is the line that we call the economic threshold. And this is when we hit a certain number of insects in our garden that kind of warrants, hey, we've done all our cultural control practices. We need to maybe spray something here. And so maybe this is where a organic or another low impact insecticide could be utilized to prevent further pest population of building up and possibly causing damage to our garden here, whether that's spreading disease or just simply sucking plant juices out of that and reducing harvest for us as well. So if we are able to know and see that buildup of that pest population and spray at that economic threshold, we can knock it back down at that control and hopefully keep those pests at bay, right? So we're never going to eliminate every single pest in the garden. If we're doing that, there's not going to be any pests for the beneficial insects to eat, right? And so we need to manage these pests based on the timing of their population that is built up. So that's what I mean by being kind of a little bit of reactive and proactive here. And I love kind of going through that graph there. So we'll dive into a little bit of what I mean in terms of spray as well. But here are two favorite recommendations when it comes to resources available for you all. And so we'll definitely provide this, Dr. Baumgartner will provide this in a follow-up email link of the home vegetable garden disease control and the you can control garden insects. And so I love charts because it's the way my brain works and organizes by host crop and then which pest might actually be utilizing that crop and how to manage them, right? So here on the left, we have home vegetable garden disease control. We go into tomato and we just see all the common diseases as we go down here and how they might appear with their major symptoms. And then also maybe some control options that we can do. And so in that disease triangle slide I had earlier, I had shown early blights. And so that was where those brown targeted spots, followed by blighting of that foliage, maybe on the underside, working its way up that plant material, and then maybe some ways to cultural practices and maybe even some products that can hopefully, again, not a reverse Uno card, but hopefully prevent further damage. And that's why it's so important to go out there and scout and make sure we don't see any patterns of this disease spreading from one plant to another plant, right? And so if we're seeing that, we do need to hopefully prevent that spread before it gets worse. Great chart there. Love that publication. Now, the You Control Garden Insects, all focus on insects here. I know we had someone talk about, I think it was Melody was talking about the Mexican bean beetle, right? And so I love this publication as well because it dives into the Mexican bean beetle, description of it, the damage, what to do. Maybe we're hand picking, using that tape, removing the larva, crushing the eggs. Um, Again, like Greg mentioned, cultural control, cleaning up that plant debris after harvest. And so here's some damage that we might see of the bite marks out of this plant material, some egg laying, the nymphal stage, the adult stage here. And then maybe if it is at that economic threshold of what to spray, right? And so here we've got a few recommendations, like 7 that we can spray bifenthrin, a few other pesticides that are labeled for use to hopefully knock that population back down, while also being mindful of some of our beneficial insects that are out in the garden as well. 2 great resources there. Getting back to scouting, if I could, when we're inspecting those plants, these injuries can come in a vast array, right? Whether it's underneath that plant material and we're getting grubs that are feeding at the base of the plant, chewing damage, egg laying within the folds of those leaves, galls, plant responses, diseases. We're just looking for anything that, doesn't appear normal for that plant. And so what that comes in as you all scouting, it helps you narrow down what that pest might be. And so a lot of times this is what sucking piercing damage looks like. And what I mean by that is these insects have here, you can see a stink bug here, essentially has a straw for a mouth part and can pierce in to that plant material and essentially suck those plant juices. So here we have a Harley Quinn bug as well that might pierce into this as well. And I know Celeste mentioned, not all bugs or not all insects are bugs. Well, all the bugs do have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So that's a type of insect called Hemiptera, and that's where we can allow them being called bugs here. And so also we have some squash bugs here, different adult, egg, and then nymphal stage here, and what that damage might look like. So some discoloration along the leaves. Maybe even within the fruiting material, we have some discoloration where that that straw has been poking into that plant material, and we're not really seeing holes that are kind of being chewed out of that leaf. Now, to compare this with a chewing mouth part, here we have a fall armyworm. And so fall armyworm, it's a type of moth, Lepidoptera here, but the larval stage is what causes most of its damage. And so the larva, easy to identify based on its inverted Y on its forehead here that you can kind of see me showing here. And then look at those big chompers. Those are the big mouth parts that are actually going to be chewing on corn here for the most part. They do like warm season grasses like Bermuda and occasionally tall fescue on those cool season grasses as well. But talking here about crops, corn. So you can see some holes that have been chewed out of these leaves here. And this is a insect that can come in waves. And this is again why it's so important to scout not just one area of our garden, but to try to get randomly throughout that garden so that we can catch this before it gets any worse. So great example there. And then we all know the chewing damage of the Japanese beetle. And here we have just the veins that are just left of this plant material and all the rest of it just being chewed by these Japanese beetles. Now, not all chewing damage is by insects, right? So here we have some deer damage on some hostas here. You can see a lot of times how they'll strip off a lot of those plant materials, and actually how that bark might look as well. And again, we kind of talked about this earlier with our container segment there, and Amy was mentioning the importance of using exclusion fencing and trying to nip this in the butt before those deer become used to getting a free meal there. And so, yes, they're cute, but we want them to prevent eating our crops there. So a few notes on managing deer. Repellents are only a short-term solution. Never really hugely recommending those, especially for those of you that aren't just into vegetable gardening. Using deer-resistant plants like, yarrow, Lenten roses, oak leaf hydrangeas, our only native hydrangea there. Great alternative that deers don't necessarily love. But they're creatures of habit. So anytime they have a successful event, they're gonna try to go back. So any way that we can disrupt that by maybe using exclusion fencing, maybe even fishing line, but that's if you want to deal with that. And then, frightening with motion activated lights or dogs, that is only mildly successful. So everyone's put pictures of their kids, and I'm not fortunate to have kids just yet, but we do have two of our fur children here that help to protect our strawberries, but don't really do a very good job. And you can see we have some exclusion fencing there as well around the strawberry patch there too. So got to give a shout out there for the dogs. Um, Vector pathogens as well. So I know when we talked about sucking mouth parts with a lot of our bug species, here's a common piercing sucking mouth part from an aphid. And so here what I mean by multiple aphids feeding on this plant stem and just how that might appear and how different aphids can appear. But aphids are very easy to identify. They're a soft-bodied insect, and they always have these cornicles on their abdomen here. So that's always a very easy way to identify aphids. And just their abundance along that stem is always very common too. But the reason I wanted to bring them up is because those piercing, sucking mouth parts with that straw are actually the cause for many of our diseases that are spread from plant to plant. So let's say you have a healthy plant that's being fed on by this aphid, then it jumps over to an unhealthy plant that might be, potentially have bacterial wilt in that cucurbit situation, that squash or zucchini. It will actually spread that bacterial wilt to a healthy plant during its feeding event. And so this is also spread by the cucumber beetle that was mentioned as well. So when we're out there scouting, yes, we might see some disease issues here, but that disease might be spread by an insect. And so we actually have to manage the insect, not the disease here. So another example of some maybe scouting things that we might see out there. Here we have perfect semicircles that have been chewed out of the margins of the leaves. Here I might think, uh-oh, we have a pest that is going out and eating some of our plants. Maybe I need to spray something real quick, right? No, that's not the case. So we actually have a native bee, the leafcutter bee, that is doing a great job to take out little pieces of leaves and take it home to its shelter and help its young to have their galleries that are protected by these leaves here by this leafcutter bee. So great example of something that we might misidentify as a pest, but is actually beneficial. Another example that I just got last week from one of our master gardeners sent me this picture and was curious what this insect is and saw some damage on, the plant and yeah, this is great scouting. We see damage on the plants and we see an insect, right? And so just because he got found, this little insect was found in a wrong place, wrong time kind of situation. I was like, oh, that's a stink bug nymph right there, right? And so there's lots of stink bugs that can cause damage. And again, they pierce into that plant material. But as a matter of fact, this is actually a beneficial insect that is called the predatory stink bug here. So the predatory stink bug here will actually feed on the brown marmorated stink bug. So this is the invasive brown marmorated stink bug. Very easy to identify. It has a striped antenna here, that white margin that you can see on that antenna. And then here we have a nymphal stage of the predatory stink bug here that kind of has a red margin, very funky looking abdomen here. Again, this is just its nymphal stage. As an adult, it will look very similar to the brown marmorated stink bug, but it will not have that white band there on its antenna. So again, I just wanted to bring this up that correct identification is very, very important. We never want to be the first to go to the bug spray, right? The gardener never wants to do that as their first alternative or first option there. So correct identification is important. And to go through this real quick, there are three main beneficial insects. We've got predators that consume other insects, parasitoids that inject an egg within the pest and emerge from and then pollinators, right? So pollinators, everyone gets all gung ho that they want to keep bees and help you with the bee population, but I'm here to say let's just plant more flowers and hopefully build up our native bee population, right? So there are over 4,000 species of native bees, right? And so if we can hopefully utilize their ecosystem services by pollinating a lot of our crops, we even talked about the squash bee earlier on in this presentation when we were talking about cucurbits. They're more efficient at pollinating your squash than the honeybee. So why don't we try to promote our native bees as much as possible? So that's a great example there. And again, just want to side tangent. Native bees are 4 times more likely to visit native flowers. All right, and then so parasitoids, again, this is what I meant by that parasitoid wasp is inserting its egg inside of a pest. Here we have a aphid as an example. Again, we can identify that aphid based on its little cornicles here. And then that aphid will then be consumed from the inside out, and we have a mummy, an exoskeleton that is left behind here. And so parasitic wasps can parasitize many different types of pests. And so one of my favorite ones was over here. We had some sun sugar tomatoes, very great tomato for snacking. Maybe I should have done a little bit better cultural practices here. It's kind of too jungly here. I should have pruned a little bit better here. But if you look closely, we have a tobacco hornworm pest that is just munching along on all these leaves. But then we have some ectoparasitoids that you can see these white egg masses here. And so we just allow those egg masses to continue their life cycle here. And eventually, just 2 days later, we have this dead tobacco hornworm, and all these little egg masses that popped out with these parasitoids. So these are some pretty cool beneficial insects that we can promote by providing them floral resources and just being mindful as to what we're spraying, when we're spraying, and to utilize cultural practices before we're spraying there. And so predators, there's, the common one that we think of is the lady beetle. Lady beetles do a fantastic job. They're not always calm and peaceful, but they eat a lot of aphids, not only just as an adult, but as their larval and nymphal stage as well. So if you're interested in all the different beneficial insects, spiders, and even mites in the Southeast, there's a great publication we'll be sure to send over to you that helps you with identifying them, from spiders to the predatory stink bugs that I had mentioned earlier, praying mantis, lacewings. There's a vast array of beneficial insects. So we don't want to go out there squashing and squishing these in the garden. We want to be promoting them. And so you'll ask me, Seth, how do we promote them? Plant a variety of flowers, right? And so I'm a big fan of the southern pollinator mixes that are utilized for our zone that are mostly natives. They can come in many different varieties here as well, but usually include a yarrow, a lot of those from the aster family, like black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, and then maybe some later season resources as well, like goldenrod. And so trying to expand that bloom period as best as possible. And again, a 2-for-1. We always talk about cover crops, and Melody did a really good job at talking about a lot of our cover crops and how to incorporate those. And so best time to seed these clovers are August 15th to October 1st. They're not only adding nitrogen to our soil, but they're also helping our pollinators. So great visitation when we focus on crimson clover and white clover. Unfortunately, the nectar resources that are available through the red clover are a little bit more difficult to access for pollinators than our crimson and white clover. So if you're going to pick clovers, try to stick to those two if you're focusing on pollinators or beneficial insects. Buckwheat, great one as well. You can have a brown thumb, a black thumb, a green thumb. It's going to grow. Just make sure we do that after the frost, and it will be killed once that frost hits in October period kind of deal there, that fall time. So IPM, we've kind of jumped into scouting, identification. Timing is everything here. And when I'm talking about timing, I'm talking about susceptible life stages of these insects. So here we have a ant policeman here that's looking for this little caterpillar that's been causing all this damage, like that fall armyworm, or in this case, the squash vine borer, right? And so eventually through metamorphosis, the squash vine borer will emerge into a butterfly, a moth here, excuse me. And so knowing that different life stages and when to control them is very key for a lot of these insects. It's not a one size fit all. And so for the squash vine borer specifically, if we're seeing this adult stage, there's probably some larvae boring into our cucurbit, squash, zucchinis here, and some cultural practices here, just even utilizing some barriers here to prevent that tunneling and going in there, or even cutting out that squash vine borer and actually providing more soil at that base of that cut after you've removed that squash vine borer and allowing that plant to develop new roots as well. So cultural controls are all around us. It's all about timing. and specifically even Japanese beetles. If we're timing to control these ones, we'd never want to kill them at the adult. Well, we can, but it's not going to do much for next year. But we want to target their susceptible life stage, which would be that August-September period there. And back to the IPM triangle, we're starting from the bottom here. So cultural practices are what Greg really jumped into, knowing our crop rotation, knowing when to mix and match these different crops that we can utilize to break up that pest population or that disease buildup. And knowing the biology of these diseases and pests is very crucial. Working up the IPM triangle, we've talked about weeding, mulching, even trap crops that potentially will keep those pests at bay and away from our main crops there. Get creative with whatever you're using in terms of barriers, whether that's cheesecloth or aluminum foil. Get creative on supporting those plants as well. We always want to support, trim, and keep those healthy plants as best as possible. Biological, those are kind of the beneficial insects that I was mentioning about predators and parasitoids, and providing those floral resources to build up their populations as well so that they can keep those pest populations at bay. And then last but not least, using those pesticides, right? And so we want to use the least toxic first, whether that's insecticidal soaps, neem oils, insect growth regulators, before moving to maybe more toxic insecticides that might have off-target kills as well. So when we're imagining the IPM here, it's like a toolbox, right? We never just want one tool. Just one screwdriver is not going to fix a lot of issues that we might be having, right? But multiple tools in that toolbox, we can hopefully get this managed in the garden situation. And so the last resource I wanted to throw out with you guys is our conventional and organic product overview for our gardens. Here you can find all the different products. Just be mindful, read the label. Make sure that label is still up to date on the crop that you're willing to spray that on. So if you're spraying a, copper product, make sure it is labeled for the fruit and vegetable that you are putting that on, and specifically which disease that we actually want to control. Remember, not all fungicides will protect every single fungus disease that builds up. So we really need to make sure we identify those correctly. Same thing with insect control. We've got the organic ones and the conventional ones available for here, and also noting which pests are controlled through here. And with that, I think I went over time, but I did want to throw out one other thing, and that is diatomaceous earth. DE is a fantastic alternative product that you could use, whether it's on cutworms or other soft-bodied insects. But I just wanted to be mindful that if we are using this, we are making sure we're not going to put it out in potentially wet conditions. It's ineffective at that point. But if it's during dry conditions, it might have good control with potentially slugs or cutworms or other soft-bodied insects. And that's always a very common question that I get every year. So with that, we'll jump into questions. And thank you for going a little bit over with me here.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Seth. That was wonderful. So, I'm going to throw this one at you. I know we didn't get into a lot of product talk, but in these types of situations, I feel like, we're always going to see folks who are wanting some softer options. And so, what do you tell us what your feel is like on insecticidal soaps? And
Yeah.
then also maybe touch on, people are just like trying to make their own insecticidal soaps at home.
Yes.
So kind of fill us
Yes.
in on both of those points of view.
Yes, and I kept alluding to soft-bodied insects. And so soft-bodied insects are like aphids, any of those insects that have not fully developed their exoskeleton. And so insecticidal soaps do a fantastic job at drying out and desiccating the outside of those insects. And so if we can spray or apply those insecticidal soaps when they actually make contact with that insect, they do have relatively good control. But if we're doing that to an adult Japanese beetle, or an adult squash bug, or any adult kind of insect that has that hardened exoskeleton, it's not going to be very effective. And specifically with, insecticidal soaps, that's why a lot of times that product overview that I provided, a lot of those immatures are controlled with it.
Yeah.
But they've got to make contact. And then the second thing too is a lot of times when we're spraying that product, potentially that product is getting on the plant material. And what it does is it could potentially burn up that plant by acting as a magnifying glass and potentially
Mm.
causing any issues on that plant material. And so that's why a lot of our trade name insecticidal soaps that you can buy at a store kind of deal are a great alternative to utilize those and support our green industry and maybe buy those instead of mixing our own that might cause more damage than we're starting with too. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we want to, thank y'all for being here. I don't want to let you go just yet. I want to give a little plug for our next series of educational fun that's coming up. So we have office hours, Friday office hours, that is going to start in June. So June 14th. If you haven't ever attended one of those, I want to encourage you to join on. It's a Zoom meeting. We get together, a lot of the agents that you've been seeing in these educational sessions through this month are part of that, and we answer questions live. So you are going to have an opportunity to send in your questions. We are actually, I can show you what that looks like. We're going to put that in the follow-up email, but you're going to have an opportunity to uh, put your questions into the question portal, include a picture, a really good quality picture if you have one, and then we're going to pull from those questions that come in, and we spend 15 minutes on landscapes, 15 minutes on fruit and veggie, 15 minutes usually on turf grass, and we just change those up throughout the season depending on what's at highest importance at that point in time. So I love that we wrapped up our last session of vegetable gardening with IPM, because as we get into the summer, you guys are going to start seeing some of these insects and diseases that we've been talking about, and you might need a little refresher course, or we might want to dive in and talk specifically about that one pest or specifically about that one disease in a little more detail. And this is your opportunity to do that. So please, don't be hesitant or hold back on sharing your questions with us. We certainly want those to come in through the portal, and then we have a way for you to actually look at um, at these questions and the answers that we have compiled through the past years of doing office hours, as well as this year. And I really do want y'all to see this really quick. So I'm going to share my screen. So here we are at uthort.com. Here's all where you're going to be searching for all these publications and information. You come on down, you see upcoming events, office hours right here. So if you click on that, this is gives you the direct link to submit your questions. It gives you the direct link to sign up for the event, and that's going to get you on the list to make sure you're getting the email reminders for the Zoom meetings. You can attach those to your calendar so you don't forget. And you can even go back and view our past office hours. So if you missed the first one that's coming up on June 14th, you can certainly go back and listen to that. And then here's that interactive map where we collect all of this information, and you can go and search through this map at your convenience. So I'm going to stop share. And again, I just want to thank y'all so much for being here. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope you are going to take this knowledge and put it to use in your vegetable gardens this year. And Natalie, do you have any other final words for us?
Oh, no, I was just going to thank people for their participation. We'll send y'all a bunch of great information tomorrow, and we look forward to interacting with you throughout the garden season. Join in on some of the office hours. We'll have fun.
All right. Thanks, y'all.